Hello, welcome to Planet 40k. Today I thought we'd check out some of the best secondary objectives that you can select for our Necron faction. So in this video we're going to be diving into the Necron chapter approved secondary objectives that are within our Necron Codex. There's 4 in total, so we'll go through them and talk about the best methods of actually scoring them and with what units and whatnot. Now of course a lot of this is relative due to a few variables. My playstyle may not actually match your playstyle, your local meta may not actually match mine, and even units that are being brought to the tabletop may not be as favourable to yourselves as they are to me, so therefore it would make certain unit choices not quite work for you. But there are also other variables such as the mission itself and of course your opponent's actual list. So it's a more of a generic guide from my point of view, but hopefully by the end of the video it'll inspire you to try a few different things or simply just show you a thing or two that you may not have already known. Because many of us, including myself, are always finding new ways to play, new combos to use, and I always say every day is a school day in 40k. Also, stick around till the end of the video for our shout out of the day, which will be going to a comment relating to the last Necron video we did, so stick around to the end of the video to see if you've been shouted out. So right, the intro has been done, let's get on to the bulk of the video, beginning with the actual Necron Codex itself. So if you have got the Codex to hand, I'll be skimming over to page 69, or if you are painting and whatnot, don't worry, as always I will be displaying everything on the screen now for us to follow quite easily there. Right then, so the first secondary objective within the Necron Codex is Code of Combat, and it stems from the No Mercy No Respite category. It can't be selected alongside other options such as Grind It Down or To the Last, as one of each category can only be selected. It's very easy to mistake if you're a beginner there. So this is an endgame objective, and you're going to be scoring 3 victory points at the end of the battle for each enemy unit that was destroyed by a Necron's noble unit from your army. So this is obviously limited in terms of who can score you the actual points. Some lists don't even field a noble, and even if you do, you may only have 1 or even 2 within your list. Now our nobles are not fantastic in terms of damage outlay. They tend to be more of a support character. However, there are ways to make this work. So there's actually 4 in fact that can be scoring this objective. The first one being probably the weakest one out of all 4 of them is the Necron Lord. Now this would actually be quite a poor choice as a unit if you're trying to score a secondary with a Necron Lord, because he's got no invuln save, and realistically he's not going to be taking a unit out all by himself. Maybe he gets lucky and finishes a lone model from an already weakened unit, but that's a best case scenario there. And it's only going to net you 3 victory points out of a possible 15, so I wouldn't advise using it. The second option is an Overlord, either the generic version or one of the named guys. Now with an invuln save, you can chuck him around a little bit more, as he's a little bit more tankier. And a lot of them come with or have access to war scythes, which can do the job. Or they've also got the options of the relics too, if you're taking the generic Overlord. But to be honest, I still think you'd be pushing your luck a little bit, trying to max out the secondary with a single Overlord. The third choice is the step up the ladder, which is the Catacomb Command Barge. Now basically it's an Overlord within a vehicle, so he's got the additional weapons, he's harder to kill, so he's going to be in the battle much longer, giving you more time to score this secondary. Now he also can fire into combat as it's a vehicle, and you can be adding a relic such as the Voltaic Staff, which can really aid the Barge when trying to succeed with this secondary. But the main go-to noble when you're attempting to max out this secondary is the Silent King. With all his weapons at range and in melee, he's going to be doing a lot of damage, and what's great about this is because the Menhirs also count towards the objective, because the objective states it's a Necron noble unit, not a Necron noble model. So the unit as a whole will carry the noble keyword due to the Silent King carrying it. So this means those strength 12 damage 6 beams will count towards this objective. So every time I've selected the Silent King, I've always maxed it out, getting 15 points. It's potentially one of the best combos we have in the Codex. So definitely take this if you're taking the Silent King. With a Command Barge you could go for it if you've got nothing else better to select from, but the 2 nobles on foot, the Necron Overlord and the Necron Lord, I wouldn't try to score it with them, it's just not going to happen. So let's move on to the next secondary objective within the book, which comes from the Battle Supremacy category, which is Purge the Vermin. So you can't be pairing this with Engaging All Fronts, for example. Again, you can only select 1 from that Battlefield Supremacy category. So this is a progressive objective. You score 2 victory points at the end of your turn for each table quarter that does not have enemy units, excluding aircraft units, wholly within that table quarter. And this objective cannot be scored in the first battle round. Now I always personally take this one even if I don't max it out, because it forces your opponent to spread their army very thin, and you can really start to pick up points fast if they don't keep units in each quarter. Unfortunately you can't score this in the first battle round, so it only leaves 4 possible turns to score, but doing the maths, if your opponent leaves 2 quarters unmanned for the 4 turns that remain, that will score you 16 points, and of course that gets capped at 15. But even if you only scored 10 points, it usually puts a real spanner in the works in terms of your opponent's tactics. Sometimes this can however backfire, and maybe they use an engage on all fronts anyway, so they're going to be planning on getting into all the quarters. But I found from my own experience that when I select this secondary, it usually serves me pretty well. It's also less of a cluster, for my own mind, because I technically don't have to do much to score it. It's all up to my opponent to try and deny it. But there are a few aiding units that will assist you in scoring this. Units such as Canoptic Scarab Swarms and Canoptic Wraiths to tie up units and prevent the movement into table quarters. Also, your movement in general needs to be slightly focused on trying to block out certain areas, again from movement or deep striking units as well. But overall, if your opponent does achieve the table quarters and prevents you from scoring, they're going to be moving very thinly. So what this actually means is if they're an elite army such as Space Marines for example, they can't afford to invest too much into each quarter. Maybe a min unit of Terminators here and there, or some Inceptors flying in here and there as well, but they're usually lone units, so they're far easier to pick off. Possibly they're going to be accompanied by a character, but now they're starting to invest points into them, which will put a target on the head. So if you clear that mini Death Star unit out, that's going to be a heap of points that you've removed from the battle. Now with stronger faction, this is a little bit more tricky. Quick factions with a high model count, Drukhari can do it, Sisters of Battle, Orcs, they've all got the capability of taking quarters fairly cheaply, so again this slightly does relate to your opponent's army, and of course your local meta. I tend to not play too much Drukhari or Sisters of Battle at present. So next within the book we've got Treasures of the Aeons. So it's another battlefield supremacy option, so it can't be taken with that Purge the Vermin secondary we've just gone over. So this is another progressive objective. Once both sides have finished deploying, your opponent will select 3 objective markers on the battlefield. Then you score a number of victory points at the end of your turn if you control 1 or more of these objective markers as shown in the table here. Control 1, you're going to get 2 points. If you control 2, you're going to get 3 points, and if you control 3, you'll score 5 points for that turn. Now the way I see this one is the more objectives on the table, the more difficult this could potentially be, due to some of the objectives being in your opponent's deployment zone. In some missions it could actually be all 3 objectives in your opponent's deployment zone, and of course your opponent gets to select which one of these are going to count. So that could be very problematic. Whereas in a smaller game you'll find it much easier to manage. Maybe only going to be 3 objectives on the entire battlefield. 1 will likely be in your own deployment zone, and 1 will likely be in the no man's land near the centre of the battle. Now it becomes a matter of who can control the mid-ground objective marker, but with the fail-safe of still being able to score your own objective, or the option of trying to take out your opponent's one in their deployment zone. So this has much more flexibility than a standard King of the Hill type setting. The objective is also nice because it stacks with your primaries. So if you are holding 2 of these every turn, that's going to be netting you 10 points minimum for your primaries, alongside the minimum of 3 points per turn for the secondaries. So if you aim to hit 2 markers per turn, you're going to be maxing out 15 victory points with this secondary objective. This one's a little bit more tactical when it comes to explaining the best methods of scoring them. So the home objectives, you can almost use anything, but preferably something a bit more sturdy, as your opponent is likely to have some sort of Alpha Strike units, especially if you're playing competitively. Warriors in large units of 20 are an easy winner for keeping hold of an objective, but Immortals can also do a job with their toughness 5 and a 3+ armor save, although there will be less of them. Units such as the Doomsday Arcs and the Doomstalkers are also an option. They're not likely going to be moving during the game because they'll be hopefully using their high profile strength 10 weaponry, and they're fairly resilient with either quantum shielding or the 4+ containment field invuln save. To add further to this, you could look into the dynasty codes. The Nihilak dynasty or the Eternal Conquerors from the custom codes will grant your unit's objective secured. So even if a unit of Vanguard veterans popped in and charged your Doomstalker, they're not going to be stealing the objective unless they actually physically take out the model. The last unit I'd like to mention here is the Canoptic Spiders. They are very slow, but if you're playing a Scarab heavy list and hoping to bring back tons of Scarabs, then these Spiders are quite viable. They can hold ground, hold an objective, and they can also move forward to the mid-ground objectives too. So speaking of mid-ground objectives, if you've got a few options here too. Again, if you're using the troop selections with the warriors, relentlessly marching forward, aided by an Overlord with a Technomancer or a Ghost Art perhaps, because they will soon start to get targeted, so it's very vital that you keep these guys reanimating. Other options consist of your fast attack area, so you've got the Canoptic Scarabs, which can very quickly pounce on those mid-ground objectives with their speed, just to put your flag in there. They won't last long, but you're going to be scoring early with them. Then by turn 2 onwards, you can get your other units up the board. Or you may want to pay a little bit more for the more resilient Canoptic Wraiths with their Wraith form ability for that 4+ invulnerable save. They're going to be tanking a lot more for a few more turns. Again, objective secured dynasties will aid them against other units trying to outnumber them. Now depending on your opponent's list, whip coils could be a real valid option here if you're just purely trying to defend against larger units. Other options include your foot slogging melee units, because they're still pretty quick. Scorpion Destroyers could manage to do it, but preferably they're going to be going hunting rather than holding ground. As for the actual distant markers that are maybe in your opponent's deployment zone, you've still got your trusty warriors, but you probably will need a Veil of Darkness relic on a character to zip them over to that location. Although finding space for them is sometimes a little bit tricky, especially if your opponent knows they need to defend the objective. So it still can be done, but maybe with a unit of Lich Guard, because their footprint is much smaller. so whether it's a 5-man unit or a 10-man unit, you should be able to get them in just fine. Faster units such as the Tomb Blades, they can do it, but they should be doing it more late game because you don't want them getting caught up in melee. They're just not going to last in melee. They're more of a shooter unit. But late game, when there's not many units on the table, by all means go and take the objectives. And then there's a few unsung heroes that could be really key here. Units such as the Hexmark Destroyer or a min unit of 5 flayed ones. Both have the deep strike ability, so you can pop in behind enemy lines. Now if you do go for the Hexmark Destroyer, you should only really be bringing him against toughness 3 armies to max out the use of his pistols, and you can also give him that pistol relic too. That's always worth it. Flayed ones, they are 10 points cheaper when you take 5, but they're only toughness 4 and they've only got a 4+ armor save, whereas the Hexmark is toughness 5 with the 3+ armor save. Both units will total 5 wounds. Reanimation is an option with the flayed ones, although they're likely going to be getting wiped out in one hit, whereas the Hexmark Destroyer might not get wiped out because it's toughness 5 and a 3+ armor save, and then on the next turn can use Living Metal just to get a wound back, just to give it a little bit of fight. So in my opinion, the Hexmark Destroyer is a better option all round, and it's also a character as well, so it can assist with the command protocols, which will include himself when giving out those directives. The other unit that has a deep strike mechanic is the Ophidian Destroyers, but you're paying a little bit more here, and they can hit pretty hard, but similar to the Scorpet Destroyers, they should be hunting, not holding ground. Okay, so let's move on to the final option, which is the Ancient Machineries. This is a shadow operation selection. This is going to be your action secondary. So it's a progressive objective. So once both sides have finished deploying, start with your opponent. The players alternate selecting objective markers that are not within any player's deployment zone to be Ancient Machinery objective markers, and then you're doing it until 3 markers have been selected. Now only Necron core units and Necron Canoptic units can attempt action. So this is done at the end of the movement phase. It pretty much follows the standard action rules found in the core rulebook. And then on the following command phase, providing that the unit is still in range of the objective, you're going to be scoring 3 victory points each time you complete the action. So this is another one I take quite often, and in a sense it's easier to achieve than the previous secondary because you only need to score 1 of them to gain 3 points. But of course you need to survive your opponent's turn in order to do it. Also, doing it in turn 5 won't score you anything because you've got no more command phases. So in order to max out this secondary, you need to be starting this early game turn 1. That's if you're base doing it around one single objective. You can of course do it over multiple objectives, but this will of course require you to invest more in terms of screening the unit that's actually doing the action. Now the best units to do this with are large units of Canoptic Scarabs. They're very cheap and have lots of wounds, so even if they do fail, your opponent is likely to put a lot of firepower into trying to remove these fairly cheap swarms off the table, which of course helps the rest of your army. Canoptic Wraiths can also do it, but it's more of a costly way of achieving it. And Canoptic Spiders, they can also do it, but they're 60 points a model and they're going to have 6 wounds, whereas instead you could take 4 Canoptic Scarabs for the same amount of points and they will carry 16 wounds. So I like to use the Scarabs, but I also like to screen them with a second unit of Scarabs, so your opponent has to make the decision to either fire at the screen or fire at the unit doing the actual action. So it's a tough choice for them because if they fail to clear the screen, then they're not very likely to make a charge and then get into the fight phase against the unit doing the action, then you're likely to score. But if you put too much into the screening unit, then it may leave them short when trying to clear off the actual unit doing the action. Also in your following turns, what I tend to do is simply switch the units around, so get the weakened unit doing the screening, while the unit that's got more models left will start doing the new action. Now don't be afraid to bail out in later turns and move to a new objective marker. With their movement of 10 inches plus the advanced move and potentially a custom code with Ancient Stir, you can be fairly fast, and also factor in that they can also fly. And on top of that, the action actually begins at the end of the movement phase, not at the beginning of the movement phase. So a few times I have deserted a marker to go for another one that's about 15 inches away or so, preventing a potential charge from your opponent coming in. Now don't be using anything crazy to do these actions, no Doomstalkers for example, that would be kind of silly. Canoptic units aren't the only units that can actually do this action, but I personally think it's a waste using core units. Large warrior units to me is a total waste because there's too much firepower there. Potentially you can use a minion unit of 10, they can pop out of a ghost dart, mid-table, start scoring points. Immortals could do it too, but they've got a decent amount of strength 5 firepower, which would be a little bit of a waste. Tomb Blades I wouldn't use for the exact same reason, and Lich Guard need to be getting into melee for the price they cost. They can't afford to be doing actions every turn, even if they have the resilient shields for their invuln saves. So that's the 4 Necron Codex secondary objectives summed up with my take on each of them. Now I regularly use the Purge of the Vermin for tactical purposes and Ancient Machineries for my Canoptic Swarms because I like to use my Canoptic Swarms, they score me points every game. I only really use the Code of Combat if the Silent King has come out to play, but generally I don't take that secondary if I'm using other nobles. And the Treasure of the Aeons secondary, I just never really pick it because it's in the same category as Purge the Vermin or Engage on All Fronts. So guys, let me know below what you take and what do you use to score them. So if you found this video useful, please drop me a sub below. It doesn't come at any cost and it's huge in terms of how the channel goes forward. And if you have already subbed, smash the like button on your exits to continue with your valued support. In fact, before we go, we've got to get the shout out of the day dealt with, which is going to Susie Duo. Their comment relating to the members list analysis part 2. So thank you very much for that comment. So the shout out is going to you today. So guys, thank you all for watching and I'll see you next time.